This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's all you need to know about me. The aim of this particular podcast, as the story suggests, is to tell the stories of films. So I tend to tell production stories, behind the scenes stories, development stories, marketing stories, all those little bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and love. Just that, the films that we know and love. This particular podcast is being recorded at the point where the world has gone into some degree of lockdown, that's an understatement, over the spread of coronavirus. So first and foremost, I do want to start by saying please stay safe, please stay brilliant, and look after yourselves. That's far more important than anything I'm going to say over the next 40 to 50 minutes. I mean, it's not going to stop me saying it, but it's far more important. The films then I tend to choose for this podcast, they have a mainstream leaning to them as a rule. They tend to be films that I'm invested in or have some degree of interest in. I do not do snark. There are other options out there if you would like some snark, but snark is not for me, I'm afraid. And the two films I'm going to talk about in this particular episode, well, one of them is pretty heavily maligned and the other is one of my favourite films of all time. So why don't we just jump in? I'm going to play you a clip from the first, a clip from the trailer, in fact, and then I'll get to the story the other side of this.
What did you say this room was called?
Sacrificial chamber.
The story's all here. This whole thing was a trap.
They're not hunting us. We're in the middle of a war.
They're using us as bait.
That then is an excerpt from the promo for 2004's AVP: Alien vs Predator, directed by Paul W.S. Anderson. He gets screenplay credit as well. Story credit goes to Anderson, Dan O'Bannon and Ronald Shusett. The latter two, of course, came up with the original Alien characters. The cast for this one, led by Sanaa Lathan, Raoul Bova's in there, Lance Henriksen, Colin Salmon, Ewan Bremner and Tommy Flanagan, all amongst the ensemble for the movie. And this was a project that, when it was finally realised, it brought to an end a gestation period of, well, the best part of 2 decades, really. That talk had been building up ever since the Alien vs Predator comic book was released in the late 1980s. So at that point, the discussions were beginning to surface at the point that the film Predator 2, which I've covered in a previous podcast, was in development. And it was a man called Peter Briggs who penned a pretty infamous spec screenplay in Hollywood circles, that he took the Alien vs Predator concept, put together a script and sent it on spec to 20th Century Fox, and 20th Century Fox was hugely interested. Briggs had written the script over a period of, well, around 6 weeks it took him for the first draft. It was called The Hunt: Alien vs Predator, and by September 1991 it was ready to go out to market. That Briggs's agent at that point was a man called Steve Kennis, and he was the one who approached Fox with it. And unbeknownst to him, and this was discussed in an interview with avpgalaxy.net, excellent site, a meeting had taken place at Fox involving Larry Gordon, producer Larry Gordon, about getting an Alien vs Predator project off the ground, and Briggs's script arrived at an opportune point. So at that point, 20th Century Fox was being headed up by a man called Joe Roth, who's directed quite a few films himself, actually, but also would head up Disney in the late 90s. The script was also tidied up. Drafts were done, a couple of further drafts in the end, and you can actually read some of those online. They've surfaced on the internet since. But there were other projects going on in the Alien and Predator universe at that particular time. That Predator 2 would be released in 1990. And Fox's immediate priority also at that point was the third Alien film that David Fincher was directing. Alien 3, of course, was a very, very troubled production that I've not done in a podcast yet. It would ultimately make it into cinemas in 1992. But whilst these various projects were in some kind of development, Briggs's Alien vs Predator project just went quiet. Nonetheless, Fox was still considering what it could do moving forward, but it then, in the aftermath of Alien 3, decided instead of pursuing Alien vs Predator at that point, it was going to press ahead with Alien Resurrection, which it duly did. The Predator franchise, meanwhile, following Predator 2, which had grossed substantially, notably less than the first Predator film, that was in some degree of stasis, but there were still discussions and plans for a possible Predator 3 movie. Some impetus, however, was lost when Joe Roth's tenure as chairman of 20th Century Fox came to an end in 1993, and as Alien Resurrection came through, that film didn't do remarkable business, but was pretty decent performance at the box office. But still, all the while in the background of this conversation about an Alien versus Predator movie was ongoing. Now, there were still some rights issues that also needed to be resolved that complicated it a little. Plus, there was ongoing concern about a film that had both creatures in it. How could that possibly work? And so it got to a point that instead Fox was looking at pressing ahead with Predator 3, and Predator 3 at one point was reportedly greenlit for a release in summer 2003. That film ultimately didn't happen. It would take Robert Rodriguez to do the next to oversee the next standalone Predator movie, which would be Predators, which would arrive many years later. But also in the mix around this time, Ridley Scott, who had just made Gladiator and Black Hawk Down, both of which were big successes, in the early 2000s was considering making an Alien 5. That he said in an interview around that time that he was less interested in an Alien film set on Earth, which there'd been some speculation would be the direction the next film would go, but more about their creation. To quote him, he said, "I always figured that a battleship carrying biomechanical organisms that could be weapons was sent into space with some space jockey who didn't last long. And that particular thread would form the genesis to a degree for the film that would become Prometheus, which, again, I'll come to in a future film stories." Fox had also, it's worth noting, in the aftermath of the success of the mid-90s hit Independence Day, had a conversation with director Roland Emmerich about possibly taking Alien vs Predator on, but he ultimately turned that project down. There were other things that he wanted to pursue. Also in the running, somewhat inevitably for the film, was James Cameron. And Cameron, who of course directed Aliens and wrote Aliens, had been working on a possible story for a future Alien movie, and Ridley Scott and James Cameron had talked about the film. Cameron worked on the story, but his involvement ended when Fox told him that it was interested in Alien versus Predator, and he would be quite critical of the idea of putting the two monsters together, even though ultimately he would go on to be quite a fan of the finished film. Also in the mix at this point, James DeMonaco, who would go on to do the Purge films. Well, he'd had a success with the screenplay for the film Negotiator, written with Kevin Fox. And they worked on a screenplay for Alien vs Predator that was a pretty straight adaptation of the comic book that had started all these conversations in the first place. However, what they came up with wasn't really something that 20th Century Fox was interested in pursuing. Separately then, Paul W.S. Anderson had been building up his cachet within Hollywood, that he'd broken through really in Hollywood circles for the film Mortal Kombat. He then went on to do Event Horizon, ironically turning down the opportunity to do Alien Resurrection so he could do Event Horizon, as the story goes. And his Resident Evil movie adaptation proved to be a big hit as well. So at this stage, he'd also in the background been working on his version of a screenplay for Alien vs Predator. But he'd come up with the story, he'd come up with the direction in which he wanted it to go, but he also knew that the pitch for 20th Century Fox would need to be quite special to get this over the line, to get some degree of interest off them, and thus he paid out of his own pocket for concept art and huge images to be produced by a man called Randy Bowen. And so when he went in to pitch the story to 20th Century Fox, to producer John Davis, he went in as much to sell the idea of a mythology as well as the narrative of the film, and he could provide these visuals as to which direction he wanted to take the movie. Davis was impressed, and as the story goes, the film was pretty much sold there and then. Anderson at this point did, however, have commitment still to the next, to the Resident Evil sequel that would be Apocalypse. He would complete the script for that film, but he would step away from directing once it became clear that he had a chance here of making Aliens vs Predator. His script would touch on elements of the comic book, but also Anderson was a huge fan of Predator, a huge fan of the first two Alien films, and he wanted to make sure that when he made the film, he would weave in references and little bits for the fans were as enthusiastic about the franchises as he was. There were stories also of other directors in the mix. It's worth touching on those. That reportedly Guillermo del Toro at one point was sounded out about possibly doing Alien vs Predator, but opted to do Hellboy instead. Hellboy, as it would happen, there is a link to Peter Briggs there as well, that it was he who came up with the original script for that, and he's credited as as one of the writers on the Hellboy movie. David Twohy, meanwhile, who'd made Pitch Black, he was also in the mix for it as a potential candidate, but it was scheduling that had really knocked him out of the picture. While Anderson then was finishing up the script for the new Resident Evil film, 20th Century Fox brought in another screenwriter to help with the script that by this point Anderson had spent many years putting this whole project together. In came Shane Solano, who's not actually credited in the screenwriting credits for the final movie, but clearly he had a fairly sizable impact on the final movie. That he would be on the film for 6 months. He would do rewriting work on the screenplay, and he would be attached to the project right through to the end of shooting, doing work as production continued. Narratively, what they decided to do with this particular film is they wanted it to be both a sequel to Predator and a prequel to Alien. That seemed the most logical point to set it, but also what they didn't want to do is use locations that had been seen previously before in the films. They did want to distance it from the previous movies, thus the decision was made to set it in the Norwegian climate that we see in the film, but also in a very heavily set-driven environment. Anderson did want continuity, though. He did want some familiarity to those who were fans of the previous films. Step forward then, Mr. Lance Henriksen, brilliant on the commentary track on the DVD. If you ever get a chance, he would step in to play the role of Charles Bishop Wayland in the movie, and this would hark back to him playing the android version of Bishop in James Cameron's Aliens movie. And to Paul W.S. Anderson, Bishop was really the key, and he always felt that it was like, and this quote's gone round quite a bit, but he said it's like Microsoft building an android with the face of Bill Gates. And so they had the idea of using Bishop and doing a little bit of retrofitting to the narrative of the franchise as a whole to make that work. But then when it got to the set as well, Henriksen had the idea of using the face and mannerisms of Bishop the android to inform the portrayal of Bishop the human being that we meet at this point in the Alien timeline. The cast for the film was primarily European. The shooting of the film took place in Europe. I'm going to come to that shortly. But there was, a fair amount of auditioning required, particularly to land the person who would take on the role of Alexa Woods in the movie. And Anderson was very clear that this was a character who's following in the steps of Sigourney Weaver a little, really. And so Sanaa Lathan would ultimately prevail in the role, but she was only cast a week or two before filming actually began on Alien vs Predator, and even then this was after Anderson had seen hundreds of possible candidates for the role, that he'd recorded many screen tests, to the point that where he came to film one or two sequences in the movie, he was very familiar with the scenes in question, because he'd had to shoot so many screen tests of those particular sequences, given the variety of actors he'd tried out in the role. There was some talk of some cameos in the midst of this as well, that at one point Arnold Schwarzenegger was believed to be open to a cameo appearance in the film, reprising the role of Dutch from the original Predator, but that this was dependent on his then impending election campaign to be governor of California. And apparently the deal was that if he lost that election, he would be willing to shoot a scene for Alien vs Predator around his home. Well, not actually in his home, because that would be quite odd, but nonetheless he was said to be open to an appearance in the movie. However, he would of course win that election campaign, and thus Schwarzenegger was doomed not to appear in Alien vs Predator after all. There was talk of digging into the Alien mythos a bit further by also bringing in the character of Yutani, and people such as Peter Weller and Gary Busey were apparently sounded out and potentially offered the role, but ultimately that part was cut from the script. It's easy to overlook the fact that the final movie was actually relatively short, came in well under 100 minutes once you factored in the end credits, and it's quite lean in terms of how much character and story stuff is packed into the movie. Filming ultimately then would begin in the Czech Republic at the end of 2003, and it would be quite a tight and fast production, really, that shooting would only go on for just over 2 months. But there were choices made, and Anderson's gives a really interesting director's commentary on the film, and he goes through some of the decisions that they had to make and opted to make in the film, because the movie cost around $60 million to make. But when they came to price it all up, the cost of just building the physical sets in Los Angeles, nothing else, the cost of building the physical sets was going to come in at $20 million. And so they scouted around the world to do it in Vancouver, in Canada. The exact same sets would cost $15 million to make. Going to Germany, they would cost $5 million to set those sets up in Berlin. And then ultimately in Prague, which is where they ended up, it cost $2 million to build the exact same sets, and straight away there was an $18 million saving just by geographically relocating the film. There were an awful lot of sets built for this movie as well. Virtually everything you see in the film, with some fairly obvious shots that aren't, but virtually everything you see is an interior, and so there was a huge number of sets that had to be built, but also they had to be quite savvy in terms of scheduling, that they were building sets, they were filming on the sets, those sets were deconstructed, and the next ones brought into the studio space, and there were one or two moments where they had to go back and get another shot, and they had to be quite savvy about how they framed particular shots, because the set that they were intending to shoot on had been taken down. There was also the small problem of KY jelly, that the watery slime that they were using for the alien, the drool coming out of its mouth, was using KY jelly to get part of that effect, but they had to import quite a lot of it, because as it turns out, the Czech Republic version of KY jelly that was being sold at the time wasn't as good, and so what happened is they imported caseloads of the stuff for the film, that they were, by the sounds of it, bringing it out from the UK to the Czech Republic, and the only thing that was ever seized by British customs on its way over to the Czech Republic, given in mind that the film was using prop weapons, was using alien effects and helmets and all sorts, the only thing that was seized by customs was all of the KY jelly, and they had to justify why they needed so much of that to be sent to a remote location in the Czech Republic. There were huge sets, and also there were huge predators. That they'd been established that from the first Predator film that the predators themselves are really tall, and this caused a problem. That the original script that Anderson had written for the movie, there were 5 predators within it, and this was ultimately dialed down to 3 for the resultant film, but still they needed the actors to play the Predator. That Kevin Peter Hall had played the Predator in the first 2 movies, but sadly he'd passed away in 1991, and so when it came to the new film, well, they had Ian White. He was going to play the lead Predator, who goes by the name of Scar in the credits of the movie, but it was slightly problematic because they struggled to find people who were 7 feet tall at least, who didn't feel claustrophobic when they put the Predator garb on, not least the helmet of the characters. And ultimately they couldn't find stunt performers of that height who could do the work, so they had one person, they had the aforementioned Ian White, but the other 2 Predators that they used in the film were not quite 7 feet. They found 2 stuntmen in Germany who were quite tall, but right throughout the film they still had to put across the impression that these Predators were the same height, and so when you don't see the legs, their legs on screen, 2 of them are standing on boxes or such like, just to appear the same height. In other cases they had to take a leaf out of what the Lord of the Rings films had done, really, in terms of framing shots to make it look like people were of the same height. Anderson also made a couple of decisions that he expected 20th Century Fox to push back on. That the film, Anderson talks in the commentary for the film about at the point they made it, cinema didn't really have the luxury of a slow build-up that it once upon a time did have with some of its stories, and he said the trend at that point was for films to move a bit faster. He still managed to make it relatively slow, in that we're nearly 3/4 of an hour in before we get to the first alien chest burster. Also, the film has quite a dampened colour palette, and this was deliberate, and it was done digitally afterwards, but they always knew they were going to digitally afterwards, and Anderson feared that 20th Century Fox would object to this, because what they'd done is when they filmed the movie, they had the actors in very colourful costumes because they knew they were going to dial it down in post-production, but Fox didn't object to this at all, and in fact, whilst the sequel would take this a bit too far, the ultimate Alien vs Predator Requiem, I'll come to that very shortly, but in terms of Alien vs Predator, Fox didn't object to the dark colour palette that Anderson was putting on screen, and he was expecting them to do so. As much as the final film does look very CG in places as well, again, Anderson has seeded this, it was done quite practically, that there was an awful lot of stuff done in camera for the movie, and they used an assortment of practical effects to realise this. There was one moment where the mouth shoots out of the mouth, effectively, of the alien queen, where on set, because this happened too quickly, all of the teeth were smashed of the alien queen, that basically she smashed her own face in, effectively. But the problem was, as they were all laughing at this practical effect going wrong, they realised that the prop guys were all on the floor trying to pick up all of these special translucent teeth they'd made for the character, and they realised that there weren't any spares, and so there was a little of an emergency where they pieced it all together. There was also the challenge of, in the first 2 Predator films, for instance, just in terms of the mythos of the character, you rarely see the Predator run. Often it's hanging around, or you just see a quick shot. And so they needed to work out just quite how to do that and how to realise that. And that was one of the challenges they faced on screen. Also, the alien, because of the techniques they'd used to keep it drooling, when they called cut, the alien would keep drooling. And so here's an image for you. Between takes, you had an alien just sat on a box drooling into a bucket. The film would wrap production 2.5 months after shooting began, and then began a very fast 3-4 month post-production phase to lock it all down. And I think that comes through a little bit in quite how digital a couple of bits in the movie were. I mean, they're fairly open about the fact there's stuff that they couldn't do practically. The bits where the tails are involved in the fight between the alien and the Predator, those had to be done with some degree of CG. To their surprise, when the film was ultimately submitted for a rating, it came back from the Motion Picture Association of America with a PG-13 rating. And this was the cause of a lot of fan consternation regarding the project, that there was a feeling, this was pretty much at the start of that trend of major franchises known for having R ratings or 15s and 18s in the UK being neutered slightly to get a more family-friendly rating. I mean, the Die Hard series would fall down this trap as well. But Alien vs Predator was a forerunner for it, even though it got a 15 in the UK. Anderson did admit he was surprised they got the rating given all the blood in the film, but then reconciled the fact, well, actually it's alien blood, it's not human blood, and perhaps that's why they got through. The swearing also is drowned out when it picks up in the film by some very loud effect, and that contributed to the film being able to get a softer rating. And the movie was locked and loaded and ready to go. In August 2004, it was released in the US. It was released without press screenings. It was released with trailers that played up the infamous tagline, "Whoever wins, we lose," which was lampooned mercilessly on the internet. And also, even before it was released, there was a lot of concern that, because I think it's fair to say that Paul W.S. Anderson was a divisive choice of director, that some people don't like his films at all, but conversely I had a lot of affection and still do for Event Horizon. And so the film, when it was released, the reviews weren't particularly kind, although going back to James Cameron, he would tell Ain't It Cool News it was at the time his third favourite of the 5 movies in the Alien saga. The film would also prove to be a hit, that it opened to $38 million in the US. It did about $80 million of total box office in America, another 97 million overseas. And so Fox banked $177 million worldwide, and that was before the DVD release of the movie. And the DVD release had inevitably the extended cut, which was the one that fans argued should have been released in the first place. But the film was the most successful film in either the Alien or Predator lines until Prometheus came along. None of them had matched the box office of this one. Paul W.S. Anderson would subsequently go back to the Resident Evil films in the aftermath of the movie and wasn't ultimately involved with 2007's Aliens vs Predator Requiem that the Strauss brothers would come in and do. That film would come in for far more criticism. It was notably one of the worst lit films, to the point where you could barely see what was going on. In terms of Alien vs Predator, though, even though it's much maligned in certain circles, I've always quite enjoyed it, really. And if you're one of those as well, rest assured that no law has been passed, to my knowledge so far, that tells you can't. After many years in gestation, it might not be the finest Alien film, it might not be the finest Predator film, it's far from both. It's still quite good fun, isn't it? Which brings me to the halfway point of the latest film stories. I am an independent producer of podcasts and magazines, and obviously in these times, any help or oxygen you can give to my projects is hugely appreciated. If you like this podcast, please do subscribe. If you don't mind, please do leave ideally a hugely positive review as well. Likewise, if you're interested in film magazines, I've got 2 of them that I've just published in the midst of all of this. Film Stories issue 15 is now shipping. Film Stories Junior issue 3 is now shipping. You can find out more about those at www.filmstories.co.uk. But I've waffled too much. I'm going to get on to the second of the 2 films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories, and it is one of my favourite films of all time. Let's go back to the start of a 1989 comedy classic. You ready for the song?
When you're sliding into first and you're feeling something burst, diarrhea. When you're sliding into third and you juicy turd, diarrhea. When you're sliding into home and your shirts are full of foam, diarrhea. When you're sitting in your Chevy and your shirts are feeling heavy, diarrhea.
Kevin, honey, where'd you learn that song?
Last summer at camp, Mom.
Ah, that was money well spent.
1989's Parenthood, directed by Ron Howard, written by Lau Gans and Babaloo Mandel. Story credit also shared with Ron Howard. The amazing ensemble cast for this one: Take a Deep Breath, Steve Martin, Mary Steenburgen, Diane Wiest, Jason Robards, Rick Moranis, Tom Hulse, Martha Plimpton, a young Keanu Reeves, Joaquin Phoenix, credited as Leaf Phoenix in there, the late Helen Shaw, Dennis Dugan in there as well. Clint Howard too, giving a pretty memorable cameo. This one started when Ron Howard was directing the film Gung Ho, which he made 2 films before Parenthood. And one of the challenges with Gung Ho was he needed to shoot some sequences inside an automobile plant, but nobody in America would allow him to do so, given the material in the movie. And so ultimately they scouted out a plant that they could use in Argentina, and thus Howard, with his young family, boarded a flight to Buenos Aires. Now, at this time, he had 3 children. One of the eldest, Bryce Dallas Howard, was 4 at this point, and he had 2 7-month-old twins, and it was going to be a 17-hour flight. And he described in an interview with Off Camera that at this point he had 24 carry-on items, 3 children. He got help from the crew just to help get everything on. He was also having to keep an eye. Well, he was basically looking after his kids while they were trying to get all the baggage on. And then 40 minutes into the flight, his eldest child, Bryce Dallas, projectile vomited all over him, and he didn't have a change of clothes. And it would be fair to say, by the description of Howard of this particular flight, that it was a very long one and a very taxing one. And it was also the genesis of the film Parenthood, that he sat there in the aftermath of it all and considered that there was something in this, and that this was a project he would like to pursue. Now, he went on to do, in the aftermath of Gung Ho, he worked with George Lucas on Willow, and that was a film that would ultimately, his reputation has grown since, but it was a disappointment at the box office. By the time filming came around on Parenthood, Howard had another child and a whole lot more experiences. He was also in partnership with Brian Grazer on the company Imagine Entertainment, and they brought in writers Babaloo Mandel and Lau Gans, who would go on to do the likes of City Slickers, and they shared basically their stories. So that opening clip that you heard was a story from one of the creative team in there, and they worked out that these 4 people had an awful lot of kids between them. They had an awful lot of stories, and they decided to press ahead with this as a movie. Now, the challenge then for writers Lau Gans and Babaloo Mandel was, how do you turn basically all of these different stories into a narrative feature? Because the original idea they were having for the film was to make it a little bit more sketch-based, to take something of Zucker Abraham Zucker's Kentucky Fried Movie or something like that, to have a series of vignettes and pull it together that way. But as they were drafting it all out, it became clear that there was kind of an emotional core to all of this. And it's quite, if you go back and look at the film, it's quite a downbeat film for an awful lot of it. And they were aware that these family stories that they were packing in there had more to them that wouldn't be served by the sketch approach. And so then they looked around for possible touch points, and one that they happened upon was Woody Allen's Hannah and Her Sisters, because they reconciled that that particular film was sort of episodic, and that it kind of lent itself to the approach that they were looking at as well. And what Lau Gans and Babaloo Mandel were looking to do was basically write 4 stories as part of the film. And this was a huge gamble. That to put some kind of structure together for that was tricky, but also it was leaning more towards a kind of television approach unless they got this right. And they describe in the behind the scenes extras on the special edition DVD that was ultimately released, how they had index cards, coloured pencils, how they had a wall full basically of material so that they could plot the through line of this film, that they had to plot each character, everything in place, and also assess how many screen minutes were being spent on each of the stories in the film, because they were aware that at the heart of the film, the big story was the main narrative focus of the movie would be the story between Steve Martin's Gil, Mary Steenburgen's Karen, and that's basically around half the film. And they had to squeeze the other 3 family stories that were going in as part and parcel into the rest of the movie. That basically once they worked out how much screen time each family was getting, it was coming up to what they would get in some cases in a television episode. Now, the instances and the stories you see within the film are exaggerations or depictions of something that happened to most of the creatives within it, apart from the fact that none of them have been drag racers, a la Keanu Reeves' character in the movie. One of my favourite stories of this is producer Brian Grazer was actually the inspiration for the moment in the movie where the brilliant Martha Plimpton and Keanu Reeves take photographs of themselves assessing the sustainability of their mattress, only for Diane Wiest, who plays Martha Plimpton's mother in the movie, to pick up the wrong pictures when she goes to get her own developed. And Grazer tells this story of how he and his girlfriend went up to the mountains. They took pictures of each other, let's just say working out and exercising in a particularly intimate way. They took those photos to be developed. Meanwhile, his girlfriend's parents, her dad was taking pictures of RV parks, and it would be fair to say her dad didn't speak to Brian Grazer for about a year afterwards. And so what happened is they were sharing these stories and they were cherry picking the best of them and putting them in the film. And that's where one particular plot line from the movie came from. The script then came together, and it was a script that people wanted to be in pretty quickly. That at the point where it was completed, the draft hit big, that a studio wanted to make it, Universal Pictures would want to make the film, and crucially also actors wanted to be in it. And this led to challenges for casting director Jane Jenkins, because to put together such a fleshed out ensemble for a movie like this, well, it was going to live or die to a degree on the casting of the film. So the lead role effectively in the film, and certainly top of the poster, is the character of Gil, ultimately played by Steve Martin in the movie. But all sorts of names were in the running for that particular role. Bill Murray was mentioned, although it was unlikely he would take that role on at that point, given that he'd only just come out of effectively a mini retirement with Scrooged and was then making Ghostbusters 2. Tom Selleck and his mighty moustache, they were in the running. Robin Williams was mentioned, Tom Hanks, Michael Keaton, who just worked with Ron Howard, he was a possible. Dan Aykroyd, likewise. In fact, one story goes that Jeff Goldblum was not just up for the role of Gil, but also the role of his brother Larry, who would ultimately be played by Tom Hulce in the film, and he actually turned both of those roles down. At least so goes the story. Once Steve Martin was identified, though, as Jane Jenkins as a possible lead in the film, that actually came together again quite quickly, that Martin was interested in the role and signed up. One person who didn't sign up quite as quickly was Jason Robards, Academy Award winner and really acting royalty. And he took some real persuading to get involved with the film. But it was his agent ultimately that persuaded him to take another look at the script and to take the job on. And he would say in the aftermath of Parenthood that he was hugely glad that he did. And in fact, one of the things he said he loved about making the film was the fact that they were all just to be able to sit around between takes and just talk, because there were a lot of people on this movie. When it actually came to the physical production of the film, there were an awful lot of human beings around. Not only was the cast for the film really quite sizable, but because there were a number of younger performers in there, also on set for them, though, needed to be their parents or guardians or chaperones. And so there were a lot of human beings. There are very few scenes in Parenthood that are just one or two people. Usually there's quite a few on screen at any one time, and so it was a busy film. Keanu Reeves, well, he landed his particular role in the film that by basically going against what everyone else had done in the auditions to that point. He plays Todd in the film, or that Todd, as Diane Wiest beautifully describes him. And most of the people who come in to audition for that role had played the character of Todd as dumb, and Reeves went completely the other way and just played him as smart, and that's what ultimately impressed the casting team, and he landed the movie. For Leaf Phoenix, well, again, Jane Jenkins had knowledge of the Phoenix family. She knew the whole Phoenix family at this point. She'd been involved in casting Stand By Me and casting River Phoenix in that one. And the Phoenix family was were spotted when they were singing at a shopping mall, and an agent saw them. And the whole family was based in Florida, which was ultimately where the production was going to be. I'll come to that very shortly. And so, as it turned out, he came in for a conversation. He happened to live in the neighbourhood, and he was hired on the spot as a local kid, and he takes on the role of Gary in the film. For Tom Hulse, perhaps most famous still for Amadeus, of course, he was attracted by the sheer ensemble of it. I'm coming back to a story with him in a second. But Rick Moranis, well, he was the tricky one, because Ron Howard really wanted Rick Moranis in the movie, and they talked about it, and Moranis was keen to be in it. But the problem was that Ghostbusters 2, that I've covered in a previous Film Stories podcast, I haven't plugged one of those for at least 12 seconds now, Ghostbusters 2 was filming at the same time. They were geographically set to be in different places in the world. That Ghostbusters 2 was mainly shot in Los Angeles, and Rick Moranis was also at this point in post-production on Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, although he'd shot his sequences at the point that these subsequent two films started shooting. And so what Moranis had to do was come to the set of Parenthood in 2-day blasts, that he would fly over from where Ghostbusters 2 was filming, where he was spending most of his time. They'd get a couple of days with him on Parenthood, and then he'd have to fly back. And he wasn't the only actor in the ensemble who was just coming in for a couple of days here and there, but Moranis was comfortably the one that racked up the most air miles doing the movie. When it came to actually the filming of Parenthood, well, Steve Martin would admit that he was a little bit nervous, and in fact it was Mary Steenburgen who said who told this story in an interview around the time of the film's release with Canadian television. And Martin apparently rang Steenburgen up and before shooting to say he was a little nervous. He hadn't got children, and could she help if the kids kind of were a bit too much? And she agreed to do so, but inevitably as these things go, it wasn't a problem. That in fact the one thing she said he came up against on the set in the end was he couldn't say no to these kids. They took to him really quickly, and so if they were asking him to do a magic trick, he would always do a magic trick. If they asked him to do a card trick, he would do another card trick, and he just basically would do what the kids wanted and struggled to say no to them. He did so say that tell director Ron Howard that there was something he wanted to try for this character, and he wouldn't go into great detail on it, but he just said to Howard, "I've got a run that I want to do that I've been practicing, and can we fit it in somewhere?" So there's a sequence in the movie where Gil's son catches a baseball at a little league game, and Gil does the completely embarrassing father by over celebrating this moment. I don't call it over celebrating, actually, I'm going with celebrating. And so Martin didn't rehearse it. He just said, "Look, can we get a wide camera on this and let me try it, and we'll see if it works." And that's where that particularly over the top and brilliant celebration in the movie comes from. I still don't think it's over the top, really. I know I said it again. What Mary Steenburgen, meanwhile, she would push back a little bit against how her character was written in the film, because she as Karen is dealing with all sorts of big decisions in the movie. But one of the ways she was seen in one of the earlier drafts to cope with that is at the end of each night she would just smoke a joint. And Steenburgen said, "Yeah, if you really want me to do that, I'll do it. But that's a different character. That's not how this character would cope. She's dealing with stuff as she goes through it. And she's not at the end of each day smoking a joint." And so she challenged the script, and the change was made. Diane Wiest, meanwhile, who would be Oscar nominated and deservedly so for Parenthood. I mean, she's so brilliant in this film, but she also was quite nervous heading to production on the movie. I think quite a lot of the actors were intimidated just by the size and quality of the ensemble they were working with. And in the end, Howard, who at this point was a young director, he was in his early 30s when he made Parenthood, pointed out to her that maybe the problem she was having, and maybe the reason she was so nervous, is that this particular character was so easy for her to play. It was so natural to her, and she was so good at it. And he just recommended to her, "Why don't you just relax and just enjoy it a little bit?" And ultimately he said that's what helped her break into that character and get that role. So absolutely pinpoint, she is wonderful in this film. Also wonderful in the film is Jason Robards. But there was a little bit of nervousness this time on Howard's part about directing him. That again, Howard was a young actor. Robards, with Academy Awards on his shelf, was a hugely esteemed and brilliant actor. I mean, his last acting role would be in Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia, and he's just wonderful in that, and a very sadly missed performer. But there was a moment where, in Howard's mind, Robards wasn't quite getting across the emotion of the moment that he needed on camera at that point. And so he went and had a conversation with Robards and was going all the way round just trying to explain, well, I think we need that, I think we need that, I think we need that. And Robards just turned to him in the end and said, Ron, do you want me to do a sadder face? And ultimately, that's what he did in the scene. I'm going spoiler light, as I always do for this podcast, but there's just a moment where he looks particularly mournful, and it's just a wonderful piece of facial non-verbal acting on Robards' part. But then Robards' role in the movie, as well as that of Tom Hulse, who plays his son, one of his many sons in the film, was bumped up as a consequence of the rehearsal process for the film. That the movie was shot in Florida, and the cast came together before filming began for a rehearsal period, which turned out to be very, very wise, because at the end of one particular rehearsal, Robards and Hulse were held back, and Hulse recalled at this point thinking he might be about to get the sack. They're not going to sack Jason Robards, are they? And so he had a little panic. But the writers basically had said that the two of them were so wonderful together in these rehearsals that would they mind going back to their hotel for a while whilst they wrote more material for them to put in the film. And so you get the whole subplot of Larry and the car and the debt as a consequence of the extra writing that was done once they'd seen what the pair of actors could do in the rehearsal process, and that's why that bit of the film, that bit of the story, is in the film. Now, the movie shot, as I just mentioned, in Florida. That filming began in September 1988 and would be completed by the middle of November 1988. And it was actually shot at large part at Universal Studios in Florida. And this was before the studios had actually opened to the public. It said that Parenthood was the first film to shoot at the new Universal project there. There was a little bit of location work done as well, but primarily it was done on this new studio complex that's now obviously a hugely popular theme park as well. Howard would say in the aftermath of having directed Willow and working with George Lucas that he felt far more confident going on to a less technically complex film such as Parenthood, and he felt far more confident with directing the movie and putting it all together. And I think you can see that really in the end film itself, that the writers, Lau Gans, Babalu Mandel, would go on to say it is their favourite thing that they'd ever written. But in terms of Howard, in terms of his upgrade as a director, I mean, he'd go on to do Backdraft in the aftermath of this one. He would said he'd earned his PhD making Willow with George. The filmmaking he felt he had control and command of, and this was a favourite film. I'm not sure if it's Howard's ultimate favourite, but this was one of the favourites of his that he'd ultimately made. And certainly it was his most personal film, given that this was the first time he'd come up with an idea for a film from scratch and seen it through to development and seen it through to the end product, if you will. That said, with the film set for release in the US in August 1989, we wouldn't actually get it in the UK until January 1990. But with the film's release set, the expectations for it were not through the roof. That the movie had cost, in spite of that incredible cast, $20 million to make. And so it was quite cheap by standards, and certainly it was a more modest production than Willow had been for Howard. But still, they wanted it to be a success, and when the reviews came in, it became quickly clear that they had one on their hands, that the reception for the movie was very strong, and rightly so. I think it's such a delightful comedy. It's got one of my favourite lines shrieked by Martha Plimpton at Keanu Reeves of all time, which I'm not going to say here because this is a very language-clean podcast, as you know. It opened to $10 million opening in the US on August 1989. It knocked Turner and Hooch, I've done that in a previous podcast, off the top slot. And just to give it some kind of context, what else was around at that time? Lethal Weapon 2 was in third. Weekend at Bernie's was fourth. When Harry Met Sally in fifth. Batman was still around. The other two big openers that weekend were Sylvester Stallone in Lock Up at number 7 and Yahoo Serious in Young Einstein. That opened at number 10 in the US. And the movie would go on ultimately to gross $100 million in the US, added another 26 million overseas, a really tidy profit for the film and well above what those initial expectations were. That it got to $100 million in the US did take a bit of a push, that ultimately its original box office release, it came a little shy of that, and so they re-released it just to nudge it over the line. But nonetheless, it was clearly a successful hit movie, and it was a successful hit movie that had a bit of a tail to it as well. Firstly, there was the idea of doing a sequel. That Howard said he doesn't as a rule do sequels to his films. The only films he's done sequels to are the Tom Hanks, Robert Langdon movies, so Da Vinci Code, those. But then those came from the books by Dan Brown. In terms of developing a sequel to one of the films that he's made, there was a conversation about it. This was one where he went back to the writers and asked them to consider doing so, but it was they who pointed out to him that we said an awful lot in one film, and if you go and do a Parenthood 2, then you kind of risk just like cheapening it a little bit. Instead, what happened with Parenthood is, first of all, fairly quickly it went to television in a version headlined by Ed Begley Jr. at first, but the original television adaptation didn't catch on. However, a second attempt to bring Parenthood to the small screen would prove to be far, far, far more successful. It started in 2010, and this one ran for 6 seasons and came to an end in 2015. It's a hugely acclaimed comedy drama, the Parenthood TV series. But for me and many others, it's the film that still sticks. That I'm a huge Steve Martin fan at the best of times. I just think he's terrific in this. But it's the whole ensemble gelling together and the sheer achievement, really, of such a multi-threaded narrative that's just hiding in the clothes of what, from the outside looking in, is just a traditional Hollywood comedy. I think it's an awful lot more than that. I think it's a really terrific piece of work. And if you go on YouTube as well, you can even find the specially shot teaser trailer they did for the film that had no footage from the movie. They really clearly cared for this an awful lot. A very personal film and one of my all-time favourite go-to movies. And that very nearly brings us to the end of this episode of Film Stories. I do just want to say something else though here, that appreciating it's harder and harder for people to find a platform for their work, particularly at a stage where most of us are in some degree of lockdown. What I'm experimenting with doing, and I'm open to any contributions or ideas of this, is putting at the end of or in the middle of this podcast just a 15-20 second promo for your podcast, free of charge, that if you do a movie podcast and you just like to do a little bit of a trailer for it, I'm quite happy to put that in the middle of an episode of Film Stories. If that's of interest to you, drop me a mail, simon@filmstories.co.uk. You can find more from me at my Twitter feed at Simon Brew. You can find more on the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. Film Stories, video Film Stories can be found on YouTube at youtube.com/Film Stories, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Film Stories Online. And we've got a whole website of pretty much daily updated movie news and features at filmstories.co.uk. But above all, above absolutely everything else, you look after yourselves. Practice some self-care, stay in, stay safe. Let's just enjoy the movies. Let's just get through whatever the next few weeks and months throw at us. And I'll be back next week with another bunch of film stories and waffling on about a whole other bunch of movies. You all take care. The best to you. Bye-bye.